I am racist. It is true. It is a thing imbued in me as much as my accent, my understanding of American English, and the fact that I was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Now, I am not racist just because I was born in Newburyport. I am racist because I was born into a culture steeped in white supremacy. 230 years ago, our nation's Constitution was written in such a way that the rights of citizenship, indeed the rights the Declaration of Independence asserted all men were due, were explicitly made unavailable to people kidnapped from Africa and enslaved here, nor their descendants, nor were those rights available to the continent's original inhabitants, nor were those rights available to women of any color, creed, or understanding. That founding document was rooted in the notion that white men, particularly white property-owning men, were the only ones worthy of being enfranchised in this new democracy. Friends, that is the definition of white supremacist culture. Now, there's an old story about a salmon swimming upstream on his final spawning journey. He's old and red, he's got a hooked jaw, and he passes some younger fry on his way, and he says, "How's the water, kids?" And they say, "Fine." And after he's gone, one of the younger fish looks at the other and says, "What's water?" The United States of America was founded, as Reverend Willie Francois likes to remind us, on stolen land and built with the labor of stolen people. Now, some of you have heard me talk about cooking with cast iron, yes? Yes, okay. Some of you haven't? Okay, so real quick, just bear with me. It's my favorite story. When you cook with cast iron, how you season the pan matters. The first thing you cook in that pan is going to flavor everything you cook thereafter in that pan. So if I cook spicy sausage first thing in a frying pan, and I make eggs a year from now in that pan, honey, they're going to taste like that sausage. Okay? America's foundational DNA is seasoned with imperialism, colonialism, genocide, mass kidnapping, and enslavement. That is the water in which we all swim. We cannot help but get wet. It is our very environment. Now, we enlightened Unitarian Universalists are not immune to the effects of white supremacist culture. The American Unitarian Association was established more than 100 years ago as an intentionally exclusive bastion of white men, specifically white men from Harvard. No, really. That's our foundational DNA. And it's a foundational DNA that caused so many denominational leaders to get a nearly terminal case of the vapors when someone suggested that the UUA might move its national headquarters outside of the 495 Beltway around Boston. The notion of venturing beyond that psychic barrier where dragons lie was utterly unthinkable. Change is hard. As an organization, Unitarian Universalism and the Unitarian Universalist Association has dropped the ball when it comes to racial justice many times. In 1963, the delegates at General Assembly declined to pass a measure requiring association member congregations to have policies prohibiting discrimination or segregation. Instead, they passed a friendly worded, "You should probably be nice to people." We're good at that. But when the opportunity was there to do the right thing, we held back because we didn't want to offend people. Years later, during a period that became known as the Black Empowerment Movement, African American UUs formed a coalition and petitioned for funds and other support to help attract and retain people of color to UU congregations and UU ministry. They got rousing support at the General Assembly that took place just months after Dr. King was assassinated. But in subsequent years, strings were attached to that money. It was a multi-year grant. And those strings required a full vote of the General Assembly each year for the organization to receive its promised funding. Every year. And people in the floor discussion poked and prodded about the details of the money management in much the same way disgruntled voters criticized the annual school budget before the town council. There's a sense of entitlement that we get to tell people how to manage their business. Now, there were good folks who try hard and other folks who didn't see why black folks needed support in the first place, and more still who thought Unitarian Universalism was probably not the right place for people of color. You just won't be comfortable here. At one point, a huge delegation of people of color walked out of General Assembly, and many never returned. Most recently, the UUA has worked hard to establish policies and procedures designed to support and center people of color within our association. Hiring policies declared clearly that all efforts would be made to achieve a diverse workforce. And then something happened this spring that sort of blew some stuff up. There was a hiring decision. Now, you know how we've gone from districts to regions, right? And so now all the regional staff mostly work out of their home because, the internet. And so each region has a lead staff person to sort of manage all the stuff. And the UUA hired a person last spring to be the what do they call it? The field staff, the lead field staff for the southern region. And with that hire, every single lead staff position in the UUA was held by a white person. Now, criticisms were leveled at the power structure, which responded indelicately, and it ended up with 3 people resigning their positions, including UUA President Peter Morales, Chief Operating Officer Harlan Lampert, and the Director of Congregational Life, Scott Taylor. Now, a 3-member triumvirate of sorts was appointed to lead our association in the time between those resignations and when eventually Susan Frederick Gray was elected as new UUA president at General Assembly. That ironic trinity of people includes former UUA President Bill Sinkford, retired Professor Leon Spencer, and Professor of Ethics at Starr King School for Ministry, Sophia Betancourt. All 3 people of color. And then the hue and cry began in earnest. There were complaints that our denomination was becoming unrecognizable. To whom? One man went so far as to call Black Lives of UU a faction that had staged a coup. White fragility was on display in all of its really unattractive iterations. Here's the thing about systems. Systems are designed to protect the system. Systems are designed to resist change, and when change comes to one part of the system, the whole organism convulses in an effort to resist that change. If that change is going to stay, the whole system must adjust to the new reality. And that means every part of the system. Those who are in recovery talk about it when one person in a family gets healthy and the rest of the family has no earthly idea how to deal with this new reality. And so there's a lot of bizarre pressure to get the person actually back to addiction, because at least they understand the system. So what happened with the hiring controversy? A couple of things. The position required a willingness to relocate and live in the district, in the region, right? They hired a white man. They had two finalists, a white man and a woman of color. And they hired the white man because he was a better fit with the national leadership team, right? They got along better. The residency requirement was waived because he didn't want to move from his house in Arizona or New Mexico, I forget which. And when people got upset, the pushback from the administration used words like hysterical, asked for some humility from those who were upset. It stopped short of saying uppity, but only just. Now, the truth is that the central Midwest region, where I used to be, the region that serves Ferguson and St. Louis, that region, that field staff team has no people of color on it. No people of color in a denomination that talks about racial justice and has within that region Ferguson and St. Louis and Chicago. Okay? Now the Northeast has no people of color either, although Boston and Providence and Hartford are certainly multicultural populations, but no people of color in the field staff. So what happened was some really brilliant people in our association created a couple of teach-ins last spring, and they, with Black Lives of UU, and they put out a whole pile of curriculum stuff for people to use, and it was really brilliant. It had stuff for discussions with adult RE, it had preaching topics, it had stuff for children, and they asked that congregations across the country and across the world take one of 2 weekends in the spring and do this teach-in. So you were in candidating week, so that didn't happen here. And another congregation I was serving at the time was in the middle of stewardship. And so we worked other stuff in. There's been a new batch of materials released for another teach-in that the UUA would like to see congregations engage in October. And I don't know that we're going to be able to meet that schedule just because we plan things so far out. We'll do what we can, but I don't know. In the meantime, I'm going to poke you today. So, one of the things that we see as an indicator of white fragility is when we, and I'm saying we because as a person with white privilege, as a person of white experience, hear people of color complain and they're angry when we try and say, look, you've got to, I can't talk with you when you're angry like this. You know what? We don't get to do that. That's kind of a jerk move. Okay? If I run over somebody's foot and they scream at me, I don't get to say, well, shh, could you be quiet? You know, you're upsetting me. Okay? Tone policing is a way that a culture of toxic niceness muzzles the spoken lived experience of a population. Sometimes we use our devotion to covenant as a weapon to do that as well. Well, that's not covenantal behavior. So those in power do not get to police the way marginalized groups express pain. Let's just be clear on that. Now, a friend of mine on the ground in St. Louis last night posted an excerpt from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And she posted this piece. But at the same time, it is as necessary for me to be as vigorous in condemning the conditions which cause persons to feel they must engage in riotous activities as it is for me to condemn the riots. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? Still Dr. King. It has failed to hear the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. As long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. Dr. King. Now, the piece that Betsy read today by Robin DiAngelo called White Fragility is in itself a provocative term. And I initially was resistant to that term because it seemed like a judgment of moral failing. But what DiAngelo describes is something very different. White people do not have the necessary emotional or spiritual muscles to deal with racial discomfort and challenge. We, and I use that term intentionally, have never had to live in situations where we were the perpetual outsiders, where we were discriminated against systemically because of who we are or who we appear to be. Now, I want you to put aside right now that one time a person of color was mean to you in school, or that neighborhood where you used to live where you were one of the few white families, or that you or someone in your family married a person of color and therefore you know what it's like. You don't. I don't. We can't. We cannot know what it is like every day to wake up in a nation founded on the notion that you and your ancestors and your progeny are not fully human. We cannot know that. There is no nation on earth where the founding ethos was rooted in the notion that white people are inherently inferior and must be enslaved, terrorized, and subjugated to keep them down. No nation on earth. We have no cultural reference of our own to compare with that of people of color in America. Now, there may be pockets of culture where white folks are unwelcome, but the difference is in who holds power. And that white folks have historically had the ability to leave when we are uncomfortable. When schools integrated, white folks moved to the suburbs. When busing happened, they moved further to the suburbs. When public pools were integrated, backyard pools suddenly became a thing. Want to guess who could afford a backyard pool? White fragility is when bad things happen to white people and there is an understanding that something is wrong about that. That's not supposed to happen. Although communities of color have been dealing with that kind of stuff always, but it's only when teenagers in the suburbs start to die of heroin overdose, right, that suddenly this is an outrage. Okay? In her article, D'Angelo describes a series of indicators, symptoms, if you will, that point toward white fragility. She writes, "White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Racial stress results from an interruption to what is racially familiar." One of the key points she makes is that white people, or people who experience white privilege, are utterly unequipped to deal with any form of racial discomfort. Those are not muscles we've ever had to exercise. We expect not to have our comfort challenged in any way, and when someone suggests that we might be wrong, that our point of view is rooted in our own white privilege, when we are forced to acknowledge that there are systems of oppression and imbalances of power and they benefit us, we do those things she described. We get defensive and angry. We're ashamed. We're outraged. And we leave. We expect racial comfort. We expect segregation or the ability to achieve it. We want to be with people like us. We expect all the movie heroes to look like us. And this works as well with patriarchy as it does with white supremacy. Remember the hoo-ha when the new Ghostbusters movie came out? Yeah, okay. We expect that our experience is considered the standard or the normal. We expect to always feel like we fit in wherever we go, and that to not fit means we are being oppressed, and that is wrong. We expect to be free of the psychic burden of race. White is the standard. Only people of color experience race, thus rendering it not a thing we have to deal with. Let me tell you about a thing I did recently. As all the best stories start these days, I posted something to Facebook, and I was confronted by a person who pointed out my privilege and colonialist posture in the thing I said. The person was not particularly gentle about it. That comeuppance felt to me like a buzzsaw of personal attack. I immediately experienced all of these things that D'Angelo was talking about. I was angry. I was ashamed. I was outraged. Don't you know who I am? I am a Brit. Oh, crap. We just raised that. Oh. And so, preparing for this sermon, I read through the white fragility thing again, and I was like, oh, I did all of the anger, fear, guilt, argumentation, silence, leaving the stress-inducing situation. At one point I was like, fine, I just won't engage with that person, and I'm just like, oh God. I became more offended as I read the list of things that I, the grand and mighty social justice warrior that I like to think I am, did this really stupid thing and then responded, at least privately to a trusted friend, exactly like a person with a nearly terminal case of white fragility. It was awful, and I hated it. I hated the experience, the discomfort that was right out of the textbook, and I hated the realization that I was human and imperfect and racist. Now, I know a thing or two about trauma and betrayal. In addition to lived experience from an exciting family, I do have a fancy certificate in pastoral care. To live in America as a person of color is to experience repeated, constant trauma. When bad treatment comes from people who are expected to be allies, it carries the added sting of a betrayal of trust, which may be why that person responded as strongly as they did. I was supposed to know better. And yet I did a thing that hurt them. So I've done all this reading, I've done all this research, I've done all this growth stuff, right? So I'm able to recognize this stuff and kind of unpack it in my own life. Imagine what happens when someone is charged with adrenaline, maybe scared, maybe angry, in a heavily armed position of authority, and when they encounter someone, say a black someone, who triggers these feelings in them. A verdict was released Friday morning in St. Louis in the murder trial of a former police officer named Jason Stockley, who shot and killed a black man after a high-speed chase back in 2011. This is 3 years before Michael Brown was murdered. Charges were not initially brought. The family eventually, a few years ago, won a wrongful death lawsuit for almost $1 million. In the video and audio tapes from the chase, from the incident, the officer who shot is heard telling his partner, "We're going to kill this mother." This guy had his personal AK-47 in the back seat of the police SUV. The gun found in Antoine Smith's car had DNA on it, but only one person's, the officer's. In his ruling, the judge wrote, "Finally, the court observes, based on its nearly 30 years on the bench, that an urban heroin dealer not in possession of a firearm would be an anomaly." Now it's that last bit that holds the key. Based on experience, an urban heroin dealer would naturally have a gun. Urban is code for black. And it should be said that at the time of the shooting, Stockley and his partner had no evidence that Smith might have been selling drugs. They just knew that he was black and that he sped away when they tried to block him into the parking lot with their SUV. Police behavior in the last 24 to 48 hours since the verdict has been terrible. Because of the miracle of cell phone technology, there is clear video of officers spraying peaceful protesters with pepper spray at random, shooting rubber bullets blindly into the crowd. And in one case, this fierce little white-haired woman put her body between protesters and the police, and so they knocked her down and marched over her, and then arrested her. Now, I'm willing to bet that those officers would not identify themselves as racist. I am aware enough to know that I am. I believe that we all are racist in this room. Okay, so how is that to hear? Yeah, okay, it's that tension right there. Do you feel anger, shame, defensive? I'm not racist, what are you saying? Now keep in mind, I'm saying this is an adjective, not a noun. Okay, noun is about identity. I am not a racist, but I am. That is one of the characteristics I carry because I grew up in this world. Do you feel tension, anger, defensiveness? Do you want to say, screw it, this minister's a nut? What were we thinking? And walk out the door, right? Disengage. I'm not going to talk to that person. And these are all of the things that D'Angelo wrote about. And this is how we can recognize our own white fragility. The more angry this sermon makes you, the more fragility you're probably experiencing. I wonder, can you say it with me? I am racist. Racist. It's hard. Now, you know the things I told you today were real. I'm citing academic sources to a group of people across the street from a university who really appreciate peer-reviewed academic papers. Right? And the evidence points to the reality that we who grew up in this country, who live and breathe and swim in the water of our culture, must be, by our very nature, racist. I am racist. Can you say it? I am racist. And it's okay if you choose not to. It's a lot to consider. It's a big thing to wrap our heads around. It's a very big awakening, and it's very humbling. Now, first I want to thank you for your patience. I know this is a long one. They'll get shorter, or you'll get used to it. But I need to make a confession of sorts. I have screwed up justice work for most of my life. I have got it wrong. I've done it wrong. I've made it about me. I've said the wrong things at exactly the wrong times. I've made grave errors that make me wince after a decade or more, and I make grave errors still. I grew up in a place where all the isms were largely the norm. Racism, sexism, heterosexism, anti-Semitism. We'd have been transphobic, but we didn't know what that was. all of that stuff. I knew early that stuff was wrong, but I didn't have the language, the skill, or the courage to name it and resist it. More than once in my lifetime, I have felt particularly smug and superior about my level of enlightenment around justice issues, only to abruptly put my foot in my mouth in a very public and embarrassing way. And it feels like each thing I learn in this work shines a light on how poorly I've been doing it. I get paralyzed by fear of doing it badly again. My desire not to screw up can keep me from acting at all, and that's not good either. I have spent too much time apologizing for my ineptitude and my shame for not doing it right. Let me tell you, marginalized people do not need my white guilt or shame or tears. What they need me to do is to shut up, listen, learn, and keep trying. Now, I expect I will still screw things up as I go. What I need to remember is that we all have to start somewhere. I feel I'm late to the party on a lot of fronts. And in other places, I get impatient with folks who are just learning about their own privilege. Compassion is good for pretty much everybody. I need to be compassionate with those who are just catching up, and I need to be compassionate with myself for not being perfect. I invite you to be that kind to yourself. May this be our practice and our prayer. Amen. So,